Hello, teachers, and welcome to your MTA webinar. My name is Rosemary Arnott, and I am one of the digital learning managers at Modern Teaching Aids. Today, the topic of our webinar is decoding decodables. Now, reading is a multifaceted skill, and although we as adults know how to do it, learning it is very complicated, and therefore teaching it is even more complex. Now, in a very broad sense, we can break up reading into two parts, successful reading, that is. We can break it up into comprehension and decoding. And today, as you can probably guess, we're going to be focusing on the decoding side of things. So the goal of this session is really to break up decoding into its little bits in order to just get more of an understanding as to what's involved in each step. Now, I think a really good place to start here is actually at the end. And that's in order to keep our goal in mind. So what are we actually trying to do when we're teaching people to read? In other words, what does it take to be a skilled reader? And when it comes to decoding, what we're really looking for here is an automatic instant recognition of words. Now, to help us sort of get into the headspace of what we're trying to teach, it's going to really help us to understand, okay, as skilled readers, what are we actually doing when we're reading? How does it work when we do have this automatic instant recognition of words? Now, research is showing that if you have a look at that image there, research is showing that skilled readers, who are sort of adult age, have become so good at word recognition that we actually recognize the word before we recognize the image. And what is super, super important to understand here is we don't read words as an entire block. We actually still recognize the individual letter sound combinations that are in that word, but we just do it really, really quickly because we've become extremely skilled at it. And what sort of happens over time is that we've stored those words in our long-term memory. So that's probably the key takeaway, is that we don't recognize the words as whole blocks. We still recognize the letter sounds, but we just do it super, super quickly. And the thing to keep in mind is that we do this because we have been exposed to the words phonology and the words orthography multiple times. And now we're going to be using these two words, phonology and orthography, frequently throughout this session. So what I want you to think of when I refer to them, when you see phonology, I want you to think of a phone, and that's because phonology is referring to sound. When we think of orthography, I want you to think of an autograph, and that's because orthography is referring to writing. So in order to become familiar enough with these words to the point that they become automated, we have repeated exposure to a word's sound in addition to the way that a word is written. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of what the actual end goal is when we are teaching someone how to read, we'll take it back to the beginning and we'll break down the little steps involved in order to actually get there. Now, throughout, what we'll be doing is we'll be sort of chatting about the role that decodable books play throughout each step. All the decodable books that I'll be looking at are from our digital reading platform, Whooshka, and we'll have a chat about that at the end if you'd like to look at that further. Now, going right back to the beginning, the first step in this whole journey is phonemic awareness. Now, the first thing to keep in mind here is that speaking in children, so, if you have a child who develops at a regular pace in a regular context, by the time they get to school, by the time they're at pre-K or kindy, they can speak. They've learned how to speak, and that's very, very natural for them. The thing to keep in mind here is that reading is not. Reading does not occur naturally, and therefore that's why it needs to be taught very explicitly. So our first thing to do is we need to leverage the knowledge that those kids already have, that knowledge being they know how to speak, they know words, they know how to say them. And what we want to do is we want to take that skill that they already know and we want to mold it into something that they'll be able to use when they're learning to read. And the first thing to do in that situation is to get them to understand that the words that they speak are made up of different sounds. So as we sort of said before, they're not just whole blocks. And now for some terminology, each individual sound in a word is called a phoneme. Now, when we come to think of decodable books, wordless books are a really creative way to explore this. Now, as you can imagine, this can be explored in a lot of different ways. But wordless books, when you're looking particularly at decodable readers, they can be a really great way to sort of explore this. So, what that might look like is you might sort of look through a book with either pre-K or K students, and you might see, okay, there's a boy, oi, and you're sort of exploring the two sounds that it's made up of. Okay, the boy's in the mud, d. And again, you're really exploring the sounds that these words are made up of. Again, just indicating that the words are made up of different phonemes and they're not just sort of block words all at once. Now, this is often called segmenting. So what you're doing is you're taking a word and you're breaking it up into its different parts. Now, what I think is really interesting here, something which I think as adults, we forget. You know, we learned how to read a long time ago, and it's so automatic for us these days that we might actually, many people might not realize just how many sounds there actually are. So even though there are 26 letters in the English alphabet, which we all know, there are in fact 44 sounds. And this is very important to teach these younger learners so that they can sort of have an awareness of these different sounds. So the sounds can be broken up into vowel sounds and consonant sounds, but then it sort of goes even further. And you can see that list on the screen there, which just sort of implies how many sounds there actually are. So I'll give you a little example here. You know, we take the O sound, the typical O sounds are sort of connected with the letter O. And what you can see is we've got dog, book, moon. So O, U, ooh, and that's 3 separate sounds associated all with that one O sound, you know, and typically unless we think about it, we might just consider that O sound has the one sound. Similarly, if you have a look at the A sound, so the A sound, just up on the screen, I've got ant, chair, car, and paw. So that's A, air, or. So that's 4 entire sounds. And so this is just sort of indicating to you just how diverse the sounds are in the English language, whether or not we recognize it. But what's really important is to draw that attention to the students so they can start to have that awareness so that they can then start to think about, okay, now how do we actually write these and how do we read them? So our next step on our decoding journey, now that the students have this understanding of the fact that their words that they speak are made up of sounds, the next thing that we do is we start to connect these sounds to particular letters in the alphabet. Now, this is also letters in the alphabet. They're also known as graphemes. So when we say graphemes, we mean writing, of course. And what you can see here when it comes to using a decodable book is that we've still got some very simple pictures, but now we have the letters of the alphabet written underneath. So what this might look like in instruction is you might sort of be saying, okay, we've got a whale. So you're still, you know, indicating that the word is made up of different sounds. But now what you might do using this decodable book is you might say, and underneath the whale, we can see the letter that is indicated by the w sound. And then the other thing to keep in mind as well is that these letters also have names. So you might say, okay, we've got the w, and that is the letter which is implied by the w. But the other piece is the name of that letter, which is, of course, W. And these are completely different skills in and of themselves and all things which these students need to learn. Then, of course, when we move on, we then start to have a look at the fact that, yes, whilst we can read these letters, we can also write them as well. And that's a whole other thing. And just a fun fact for you, so whilst the skill of decoding refers to, you know, cracking the code, when you read it, you understand what it means. Learning to actually create the code yourself, this is what's called encoding. So decoding, you're learning to crack the code and understand it, and then encoding, you're learning to write the code yourself. That is a whole other thing though. And then we move on to phonics. So phonics is, of course, the understanding that the different sounds in our language are made up of different letters and also combinations of letters. And that's really, really important. And these 44 sounds that we have in our language are all represented in different ways using these letters. And this is obviously, as you can imagine, where things start to get a little bit complicated. You can see up on the screen there, I've got a classic, very confusing sound to learn, which is the sh sound. There's a lot of different ways to spell that, and therefore a lot of different ways to read it as well, because obviously when we talk about spelling and reading, they sort of come hand in hand. But obviously, as we know, I mean, children are sort of learning to spell and read all throughout primary school. It takes a really, really long time. So what's important is that we know that we just need to start one step at a time. And what that looks like is we take those single letter sounds that we were just looking at, and we're blending them together to create words. And that is what is called decoding. So what this might look like in a decodable book, for example, so you can see up on the screen now, I have a book which is made up of actual words. So as opposed to just the letters of what we saw before, now we've got actual words in the book. And what you'll notice is that the words are very, very short, sharp words. And they are words which use only the specific letter sounds which the book is actually targeting. And now they're only short, sharp letter sounds. So what you'll see, for example, is that this book is focusing particularly on the d, j, o, k sound. And so when you actually go through that book, you'll be able to see that the students are just looking at very simple words. So p, I, g, s, a, t. But the purpose of this book is for now the students to actually practice blending those sounds together to read a word. And I know it sounds, you know, like a tiny step, but it's a really, really important one. So the difference between a student saying p, I, g and pig, that's a whole skill in itself. And again, as we said, that's called blending. So the way that we teach a child to do that is we ask them to sort of elongate their sounds together. So rather than p, I, g, we want them to say pig, and we want them to blend it together. And as you can imagine, it's really difficult to teach this. So these little books are very important so the students can actually practice that. All right, so as we're starting to realize, there are a lot of different letter combinations which do actually sort of spell the different sounds of the English language. And what's really, really important here is that the children learn all of them. We can't have any gaps in their knowledge, because if they have gaps, they're not going to know how to read these sounds. They're not going to know how to decode these words. So what's really important here is to have a solid scope and sequence, a particular structure in place to make sure that your students are systematically learning these sounds to ensure that they go through each and every one. Now, what I've done here is I've just used the scope and sequence from Whooshka Reading as an example for you. And what you can see is that we have phases 1 through to 6, and we have specific sounds listed in every single one. And now what this looks like when the students actually go through this systematically is it's really broken up into the different parts to ensure that there are no gaps. So what you can see here, for example, is I have book number 1 from phase 2. And you can see book number 1 focuses on the first 4 sounds. And then we've got book number 2, the next 4 sounds. Book number 3, the next 4 sounds, and so on and so on and so on. So the idea here is if a student is learning through this entire scope and sequence systematically, they will learn every single sound. And of course, the importance with that is they'll be able to decode every single sound. And what's really key here is that, for example, if I look down here at book 4, if a student has not learnt, maybe if a student hasn't sort of explored book 1 or any of the sounds in book 1, they might find themselves in a bit of strife here, because what this sort of table depicts, you've got the sounds in the grey scale. That means that they won't be looked at in this book because they haven't been learnt yet. And whilst the sounds in the black boxes are the focus sounds, the sounds in black and white are sounds which they've already learnt, so they will be somewhere in the book. So it's really important that the students do sort of go through that systematically in whichever scope and sequence that you're using at your school. It's really important that the students go through systematically so that they don't have any gaps in their knowledge, so that they can still, you know, read all of those words that do appear in the decodable book. And of course, the other piece of that is making sure that the students have some variety. We want to make sure that their motivation and their engagement stays nice and high. We don't want to, have to just give them this one book when they're learning the s, at, p. We want to be able to give them a whole bunch of different ones so they can really sort of consolidate that knowledge. So you can see here there are some fiction books, some non-fiction books, and they're all just focusing on those 4 sounds. So that's really important. Okay, so what I've done here, again, just using the scope and sequence from Whooshka Reading, from the Decodable library, sorry, is I wanted to sort of indicate to you just how many rules there actually are when it comes to learning how to decode. Now, there are lots and lots. I have by no means indicated all of them. I've tried to just give you a little bit of an insight into some, but have a look and I'll sort of go through some of them. So first of all, we have our short vowel sounds, and we also have our short consonant sounds. Now, these 2 groups are, the very early sounds that are learnt. They're definitely sort of covered in your early kindy phases. Now, as we sort of move along, then we have digraphs. Now, digraphs are 2 letters pushed together. So, for example, you can see here CH, but they make one sound. So, for example, ch, that is one sound, and the same sh, that is one sound. So that's what makes a digraph. The next thing is we have our split digraphs. So what you can see down here is that we have combinations of 2 letters, and you can see that they're vowels. Now, this is often called the magic E or the bossy E, actually, as my kindergarten niece mentioned to me the other day. And what these refer to is you still have the 2 letters, the consonant is in the middle, but the E has its own rule and it changes the vowel. So that's why it's known as a split digraph, because those 2 letters are still sort of working together. We've got the long vowel sounds, so long meaning you consider the short vowel, so it's very short, but then the long is an A or an E, so it's just a different sound. We've got the R-controlled vowels, which of course, the rules change as soon as you put a particular sound on it. We've got our trigraphs, which is, if you understand the concept of a digraph, you'll understand that a trigraph is one sound, which is made up of 3 different letters pushed together. And where it gets complicated is you'll start to see that some of these sounds are actually, they fall into 2 categories. So you can see we've got some which are trigraphs as well as R-controlled vowels. We've got our blends, and now our blends here, this is when we're sort of looking at the difference between a blend and a digraph. So a blend here is when we have, let's say, for example, the NK. That's when, yes, we have 2 letters pushed together, like in the digraph, but the difference between it is that both the N and the K still keep their individual sounds, but they're just said together. So, for example, unk. So I've still got my n sound and my k sound, but they're pushed together, unk. So for example, skunk, whereas the digraph is just that one sound. And then just to be really complicated, we've got the digraph blend, which is a digraph pushed together with another consonant. We've got the doubles, also known as the protector rule, which is the double letters at the end. And then, of course, just to be really confusing, we've got other rules which don't actually fall under any of these categories, and that's things like your and your qu with your q and your u together. And then just if this, wasn't confusing enough, our poor 4- and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, they also need to come up against words which are not decodable at all. And these are what we call sight words. Now, I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that no matter how many decoding strategies students have, no matter if they've memorized every single one of them and they're the smartest student in the world, you cannot decode non-decodable words. That's the most important thing to remember here. So with sight words, they just have to be memorized. Now, on that topic, I did want to talk a little bit about sight and high frequency words because they are actually different, but they are often grouped together, but they're not the same thing. So when we're thinking of sight words, as we said before, these are non-decodable words, so words that do not follow these rules. And again, being adults and skilled readers, we know how to read all these words. So sometimes it's difficult to actually recognize which words are in fact non-decodable. But if any of you have tried to teach your kindy students the word the, it'll probably become pretty apparent that that is a non-decodable word. And that's because if we follow all of the regular decoding rules, this word should be pronounced, but it's just not. And so that is a sight word. Sight word meaning they just have to learn it by memory. And then when we come to think of high frequency words, so what we're talking about here, these words are in fact decodable. However, they're more referred to words which those students, maybe they just haven't learnt the rules of that word yet. So the example I put up on the board there is, for example, so in kindergarten, they will definitely need to be able to read the word like. It's a very simple word. It's probably going to come up in some of their decodable books. However, the particular rule which this word actually follows is that magic E rule, and they might not have learnt that yet, because that's a little bit down the track. So what we would say is this is just a high frequency word. And that means even though they haven't learned the rule yet, we still just teach it to them anyway, and it's just a word that they learn to recognize off of memory. And then what you'll often see in decodable books, and again, this is a decodable book from Wooshka, what you'll often see is that they sort of, they have these tricky words lists at the start of a book, and they sort of combine these sight words and these high frequency words together, just to sort of have a spot and have a chance for the students to review these words before they actually start reading. Now, in terms of instruction in the classroom, we've looked at phonemic awareness, we've looked at looking at graphemes, we've looked at all the different sort of patterns and rules. What does this actually look like when you're in the classroom? Now, this can take many different forms. There's going to be a whole bunch of different ways to do this. I'm sure you all do this differently. But just as an example, what you could do is so your warm up. This is important just to really sort of practice the little steps that we've taken so far, just to really engage the students and to get them thinking. The engage section, obviously, that's just really important to make sure that the students are interested and get them motivated. Phonemic awareness, warming them up in terms of the sounds. Okay, so let's remember that the words are made up of different sounds. And then in the practicing section, we're looking at, can we make sure that we remember the link between the sound and writing the letters? And then we've got the segmenting and the blending as well. And what I've actually found here is just a little snippet for you. It's literally a minute long. This is actually from the NESA website. And this is going to show you just a little video of a teacher who is engaging in an explicit lesson, and she's doing these two, so the warm up and the practice, and it's just interesting to see how she does it.
All right, now boys and girls, who can tell me what sound this is right here? What sound do these two letters make, Mari? Ah. Can everybody say ah? Ah. Beautiful. I'd like you to turn to the person that is right beside you, or the people that are near you, and think of one or two words that you heard that has the R in it. Get your bubble gum ready. How many lines would I write on my board right now? Scarlett Dawn? Two. So nobody pick up your texter. Let me just do my two. Okay. Now, I'd like you to help me. What's this sound going to be at the end? Addison? What was that one? Sorry, sweetheart? Good girl. Everybody say Now, what's this action for our What's our action? Show me. Mum makes many meals. Fantastic. And I'd like you to fill in your last sound. Okay. Now, who thinks they might know what might be the first sound on the first line? Bead. Ah. And how do we do an R? What two letters make R? Henry? Fantastic, good boy. Let's fill in your R on your first line. Wonderful. Now what word have we just made? Beautiful, let's rub that out.
So you can see there she's really incorporating all of the little teeny tiny steps that we've just looked at. So she's incorporating phonemic awareness, breaking the word up into the different sounds. The thing that I really love is she sort of says, how many lines do I draw on my board? and they say 2. I think the automatic response for any adult would be, well, 3, because there's 3 letters. But the fact that all the kids say 2 lines, it indicates to you that they understand that it is made up of 2 sounds as opposed to letters. And then they go through to sort of show that understanding of the fact that the R sound is in fact made up of 2 different letters. And then they get to the end and then they blend the word together. And so that's really what a typical sort of explicit lesson could actually look like. But then the next piece, of course, is more of the body of the lesson, which is getting the kids to actually read using this knowledge that they now have. So using their new understanding of the R sound, getting them to actually read using this. And this is where the decodable books come in. So to give you an example, I'll stop that. To give you an example of what that might look like, you can see I've got a whole bunch of different books that I'm just putting up here. All decodable books which explore the R sound. So the thing to keep in mind with decodable books is they have actually been designed to be able to be read independently by the students. And the whole point of that is so that the students don't actually need the teacher sitting side by side with them in order to successfully read. There's one teacher, there's 30 students. We want the students to be able to sort of read on their own accord. And so what you'll see here, again, going back to that idea of the students sort of progressing through the scope and sequence systematically, you'll see that this book, for example, On the Farm, this book is targeting the R sound and as well the air sound. But as long as the students have systematically learnt these sounds as well, they will be able to read this book independently. And then you can see they've got the tricky words as well. So people like to do this in different ways. You know, you might have the students in groups. You might have the teacher doing a reading session, doing something else, you know, working on comprehension. You might have another session where the students are reading their decodable books independently. You might have another session, you know, when they're working on a quiz or when they're using other manipulatives to do another activity. But that is the beauty of the decodable books, and that they can, in fact, actually read them independently. So that's all from me. I do hope that was useful. What you'll see up on the board here is the real myriad of resources which I actually got my information from today. I think my favorite part of creating this presentation, to be honest, was just really exploring the total mountain of research and just information and just sharing of passion that there is out there online. There are so many teachers who want to share their knowledge and understanding just with other teachers. So if you're feeling like you'd like to explore this further, by all means, go and research. There are so many teachers out there who just want to share their passion for this. I hope that has been a useful session. As I said at the start, all of the decodable books that I used and the scope and sequence as well, they were all from MTA's digital reading platform called Whooshka. If you are interested in having a look at Whooshka, or if you'd like to get some free access, if you'd like to have a little bit of a trial, by all means, please reach out. Alternatively, you can just scan the QR code up in the top of the corner here, and that will lead you to the page where you can get some free access for 30 days. But otherwise, as I said, my name is Rosemary Arnott. I'm one of the digital learning managers at MTA. It's been an absolute pleasure to lead this webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.